Welcome back. We're doing a two-parter. Well, we're doing the second part of a two-parter. So one of my earlier videos was about the Legends of the First Empire series, which is a 6-book series, but I only talked about the first 3. Well, yeah, now we're talking about the second 3, and also kind of all 6 as a collective, because, you know, the series is done now. So if you haven't read Legends of the First Empire, or you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, you might consider watching the first video. I'll do the card thing if I can figure out how to do that. Put a card somewhere in the corner, or I'll just put the link in the description so you can watch that if you haven't, or don't. It's up to you. I'll try not to talk about specific events from the first 3 books because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who is still considering reading this, because, you know, they want to know how the whole series pans out before they read it. If that's you, I don't want to spoil it for you, but I will have to reference things in a general way just to talk about what happens in these books. I feel like it's impossible not to. So depends how sensitive you are to spoilers, I guess. It's up to you. So if you are not aware, I really love this series. I really love Michael J. Sullivan's work in general. And the first half of this series, while not perfect, you know, nothing is ever really perfect, and it's all a matter of taste at the end of the day, it does pretty much everything it's trying to do really, really well. And you couldn't point out significant flaws, I feel, in the execution of what he was going for. The back half of this series is a little bit more inconsistent, and I don't mean to say that it's bad. I don't want to sound like a downer here. I don't want to give off the impression that I didn't enjoy it, because I really enjoyed it. I still really like these books. But it is a little bit more up and down than the first 3 books are. I think the main reason why the back half of this series does feel a little bit more up and down comes down to pacing. And maybe pacing is not the best word for it, but essentially the first 3 books, while they aren't necessarily breakneck speed stories, they all feel like a complete chapter of the story. Of course, it's a 6-book series, so none of them are going to be standalone, but all of them manage to tell what feels like a complete chapter. And the second half of the series doesn't necessarily feel that way. It is a little bit more disjointed, and books 4 and 5 especially feel kind of like they just kind of end without completing the story that they're setting out to tell. There's a lot of little nitpicky things that you could take issue with the pacing of books 4 and 5 especially. For example, the start of book 4 takes place over like a long period of time, and while previous books all felt like they were telling one tightly written story from start to finish that was a chapter in this larger story, book 4 is kind of like status updates. It's kind of just like progress reports on this war that is currently ongoing as of the end of book 3. And you're just kind of jumping around in time in a little bit of a disjointed manner. But by the end of book 4, I was glad that he ripped the band-aid off and just gave us what we needed to know in that time period, and then just went, all right, here's the actual story of this book. Here's what we're doing now. Still, it is a critique of this book. It's not necessarily as tight as the previous 3 were. Book 4 and 5 in general do have that middle book syndrome. It's definitely more noticeable than it was in book 2. And what I mean by middle book syndrome is they're very concerned with setup and putting the pieces in the right place, sometimes to the detriment of their ability to stand as an individual story separate from the overall arc of the series. Now, if you're a seasoned fantasy reader, I promise you have read way worse middle books than these ones, all right? These are not bad middle books. They are not pointless. They don't waste time. In fact, they're actually the shortest books in the series. At least the audio versions are the shortest. So they're not meandering around and doing nothing, right? He has complete grasp of where the story is going at all times. So it's not that the pacing is bad or unbearable in any way. It's just that as a complete story, they don't stand on their own that well. It wasn't really an issue for me in the long run because I read them all in one go. But I think if I waited like a year for each of these books, I would have been a little frustrated, because in the first 3 books, they all have their goal that is set at some point during the first third of the book, the first act. and by the end of the book, that goal is accomplished, and the pieces are in place for the next goal in the next book. Am I being a bit of a negative Nancy? I might be a little bit negative. At least it might sound like I'm being a little bit negative, but I'm not like cold on these books. I really do like all 3 of the remaining books. I just feel like I have to acknowledge that it's a little bit more up and down. So if you're expecting as polished a product in every single book as you got in the first 3, So what does the second half of the series do well? How does it justify the slower pacing in comparison with the first half of the series? Well, the answer is twofold: character and world. If you ask me, a slower pace is justified if it is in service of the characters and the world. If there is value attained there, which it is, like the characters are great and the world is already great. It was already well done in the first half of the series, but the second half takes things to another level. Especially when it comes to the world building, I can honestly say that this series has gone in directions that I have never seen a fantasy series go in. And that wasn't something that I expected when I started reading these books. Remember, this is a series that is marketed as fantasy for fantasy fans, as something that does classic fantasy well. I was not expecting anywhere near the level of depth in the world building as it was presented in these books. Like, he wrote an entire other series set in the same world, and I was constantly like blown away by the revelations of this series, and they constantly recontextualize everything that happens earlier in the books. Once you find out some of the secrets and get hints about the next secrets, they constantly recontextualize everything that happened earlier, and they recontextualize everything that happens in the sequel series. Well, it's not the sequel because it came first, but you get the idea. It's masterfully done world building. Like, he really went above and beyond and played with some concepts that I think any fan of the genre would be fascinated by, because you just don't see those concepts played with that often, maybe alluded to, but never explored in this amount of depth. The other thing he does really well with the extra time granted by the slowdown in pacing is work on the characters. The characters were great already, but they get to another level in the back half of the series. And again, I was kind of blown away by just how great and how in-depth he got with the character writing. I feel like the best example of that is Tressa. For anyone who hasn't read the books, Tressa is a character who has been around since book 1. And in book 1, she was basically a secondary antagonist who it seemed like had no actual significance or relevance from a long-term perspective. Like, she did her job well as a secondary antagonist because she was very easy to hate. But it could have just ended there. Like, she could have just disappeared from the story, gotten a couple of offhand mentions now and again in the rest of the books, and everyone would have been satisfied by that. We all would have been like, yeah, whatever, who cares about her? We got more important things to worry about. It would have been business as usual if we just left it at that. And yet he takes this character who was not really interesting in any meaningful way beyond just being a bitch, and he does phenomenal work with her. Like, her arc in the second half of this series is so well done. I'm really impressed. And there's this dynamic especially between the character of Tressa and this other character named Moya. Moya is basically this badass chick. She kicks a lot of ass. She really kicks a lot of ass. She's extremely defiant. She's kind of aggressive. She can be a little bit aggro at times for sure, but she's likable and very easy to root for. Whereas Tressa, again, kind of a bitch. And yet in book 4, by the end of the book, without even realizing it, the dynamic kind of flipped, and I was just like, wait a second, how did this happen? How is Tressa now the one that I'm rooting for? When did this occur? Like, honestly, the dynamic between the characters was already well done, but it develops so organically as you learn more about the characters and as they change on this journey that they go on in these books. I got no complaints really with the character work. It's just really good. I also want to mention Suri, who I already said was one of my favorite characters in the first video, and she's even more awesome in the second half of the series. I want to go into a little bit more depth about why I think she's a great character. Suri fulfills a role you see pretty often in fantasy series. She's the overpowered one. She can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat when it seems unlikely. She is that character in the series. And it's very easy for that character to be the worst character. It's hard to get invested in someone when they have so much power, and sometimes it takes stakes away from the story. So you kind of target your frustration towards the overpowered character because they are in some ways responsible for the stakes not feeling as high as they could. But this series does not suffer from that flaw. Suri does not suffer from that flaw, and in fact is one of the best characters despite the fact that she is overpowered. And the reason why she's so great is because everything she does is earned. Nothing is easy for her just because she has power. In fact, I would go as far as to say that being Suri is suffering. It's tough to be in her position. So whenever Suri does do anything badass, whenever she does flex all the power that she has, it feels really earned. It never feels like it was too easy because there are sacrifices that have to be made when you have that amount of power. And I think this is a textbook example of how you do a character like this. She could so easily be a Mary Sue in another series, but she isn't. So point is that the story is well served by the more deliberate pacing in the second half of the series. And my god, is the payoff for every character great. Every single one of them gets their time to shine in these books. No one is left behind, no one is superfluous. Everyone has their moment. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my boy Wraith, who hit me right in the feels, I gotta say. Right in the feels. The twists and turns in the story as it comes to a conclusion, and the reveals on reveals on reveals. This is like the densest onion of all time, bro. I'm telling you, this shit is deep. Still, the pacing is not perfect. I do think that is a genuine flaw of the series. You can kind of feel how he's playing around with the timelines to make sure everything lines up perfectly for the climaxes to occur in the order that they need to occur. It just isn't as organic as the first 3 books were when it comes to pacing. But it is hard to be too upset by it when you consider how great the story actually is and how well the characters and world are served by the pacing. I have a couple more small complaints, one non-spoiler and one that is a little bit of minor spoiler territory for book 4 mostly. The non-spoiler complaint: there are a couple characters who I think could have used like one more scene just to cap off, you know, this is where they are now. This is the conclusion for this character. Here you go. We didn't really get that. The other complaint, how do I say this as vaguely as possible? If you don't want to know anything, I'll put like a timestamp or something. But if you're okay with like minor vague-ish spoilers, that's how I'll talk about it. So one of the aspects of magic in this world is foresight, the ability to sort of predict what's going to happen in the future in a vague sense. Like even in the first book, there's a character who can like read the signs in nature or whatever and predict that something bad is going to happen, which kind of sets a lot of the events of the story in motion. So that's a thing in the series, and there is a character who does that quite a bit, but it's very subtle for the most part in the first 3 books. It's kind of in the background, and everything they predict is more or less a logical conclusion that could be come to just by examining the facts that were available to the characters at that point in time. You know, nothing is too egregious when it comes to seeing what's going to happen in the future. However, in book 4, this does kind of a complete 180, and we start to get like, hey, this is what's going to happen, and this is exactly what you need to do when that happens, and then when that happens, this is what you'll have to do after that. And it's kind of like, wait, what? You can do that? Like, you're just going to do that? It just felt like a little bit of a betrayal. Of course, nothing was stated outright, because this aspect of the magic in this world is kind of shrouded in mystery for the most part. There's a lot of intrigue in this world, like I said, so you can't really be too upset when things switch up on you a little bit. But I was a little upset, all right? I'm not gonna lie. I felt a little bit betrayed. I felt like there was an unspoken agreement that was broken. It wasn't a deal breaker though. The story is still really good, and there is justification for that kind of thing later on in the story. Still, I did feel a little bit betrayed at that moment in time. So, Legends of the First Empire, as a collective, what's the verdict? Not just on the last 3 books, the entire series. The verdict is it's really good. There is a certain expectation with a series like this, as it is a classic epic fantasy, and it delivers on all fronts, and even goes above and beyond what you might expect just from the vibe of the series and how it's marketed to people and how people talk about it. The story is really, really well laid out. The characters are well written, organic. They all have great character arcs. The climaxes, the payoffs, everything is all there. And the world building, it goes so much deeper than you would expect it to. And everything that is revealed is satisfying. There are no ass pulls here. There's no convoluted mumbo jumbo here. It's just really well done. It's not in your face, super exposition-y either. If you like fantasy or are open to fantasy, I think this is probably one of the better modern fantasy series, especially if you're trying to dip your toes into the genre or into reading in general. It's not too far a departure from the more video gamey settings that we are all familiar with. If you've played like any fantasy RPG in your life, then a lot of things are gonna feel familiar enough that nothing will be too daunting. And the way that the series is written and the way that the story plays out, it is never overwhelming. But everything it does is really well done. Who would I not recommend this series to? If you're the type of person who gets caught up on prose a lot, and that's a really important thing to you, the prose in Michael J. Sullivan's books could be best described as like workmanlike. It gets the job done, you know? And that's fine for me. I don't have a problem with that at all. But if it's a problem for you, then this might not be the series for you. And obviously, if you don't like high fantasy or epic fantasy, if the idea of reading about elves makes you nauseous, then don't read these. Just go read something else. But fantasy is mainstream now, right? Nobody thinks you're a loser for talking about elves and dwarves anymore, right? I hope not. Anyways, that's about all I have to say about this series, I think. If you've read the books, let me know how you feel. You know, were you satisfied with the ending? Were you disappointed by anything? How does it compare to Rhaenyra in your eyes, if you've read Rhaenyra as well? I welcome all your comments, so feel free to let me know how you feel. With that said, I'm gonna check out. Bye!